But what we wanted to really do throughout the book was see where quarantine was being experimented with, or the technical limits of isolation were being pushed today. Where would such a person go? This is down in a salt mine known as the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's outside Carlsbad, New Mexico. It's near the border with Texas. So to be clear, it's not a quarantine facility for nuclear waste, which I'll get to in a second. It's an isolation facility, and on top of that, it's a pilot plant, so it's an experimental facility. But so this is where nuclear waste is being buried by the US government. It's not the kind of nuclear waste that you might picture, but it's nuclear waste in the sense of fabrics and gowns and gloves and scientific equipment like microscopes, desks, pens, papers that were used by scientists in laboratories where they were developing the nation's nuclear arsenal. And so those materials that may or may not be contaminated, but also do pose a risk to the biosphere, are being shipped to New Mexico. They're being put into giant caskets, and then they're being lowered into the depths of the earth, 2,150 feet, into these huge salt deposits. The room itself is very roughly the size of a tennis court, and then there's 56 of those rooms throughout these panels. So when you go down into the depths and drive around through the salt, you can often enter into hallways where it's difficult even necessarily to see the very end of it. But so there are several interesting things here. One is that the salt is actually a kind of a plastic mineral. What I mean by that is that when you apply enough pressure to it, salt moves almost like a marshmallow, or it was described to us as molasses in January. And so when you look closely, and you can see it a little bit in this photograph, the salt is actually crushing its way back into these corridors and rooms. But that's by design. So salt is not only resistant to radiation and can block it, so it's already a shield against the radioisotopes that are being emitted from the waste, or should there be an accident. But also the whole point is that once humans abandon this architectural structure and no longer go down into it, the salt will just continue to crush. It'll squeeze in and basically form a kind of crystalline tomb for all of the things that are buried within it. There's a project that really caught our attention because it was something that we found throughout the history of quarantine, which was how do you communicate risk to individuals and to people, and how do they believe what you're saying? So if you're trying to convince people thousands of generations from now, and you're dealing with nuclear waste that's going to be dangerous for at least 10,000 and possibly many millions of years, how do you convince them that this is in fact a dangerous substance, that they should not in fact dig it up, and that it's something to be avoided? We saw even during COVID-19 that people didn't believe that COVID, and still don't believe that it's a real disease, that think that the vaccine is actually a bioweapon. There are people that if you don't trust the information that's coming to you, why on earth would you trust some sign that you found that was written 8,000 years ago and it's in the middle of the desert telling you not to dig? So that may sound like a very niche thing to be concerned about, but in fact, there's a lot of real worry that WIP is going to be disinterred. And so beginning in the 1980s, there was a series of Department of Energy funded roundtables that looked at bringing together semioticians, anthropologists, linguists, experts in religion, even experts in radiation sickness, and brought them all together to kind of brainstorm what we could do to prepare future generations to believe the message of danger. Some is kind of titanic land art. There's one that's a giant landscape of thorns made of concrete. The idea apparently being that aggressive geometric shapes would be just so terrifying that people will leave and they would never consider digging there. Another one of my personal favorites was I guess the Department of Energy in the 1980s was so sensitive to the sight of Edvard Munch's famous painting, The Scream, but that was considered so terrifying in the 1980s apparently that Edvard Munch's The Scream was going to be reproduced at various scales throughout the WIP site in order to scare future generations from digging there. Another one was the Ray cat proposal, which was actually to make cats, genetically modify domestic house cats, so that if cats came into the region and there was loose radiation and then radionuclides in the environment, the cats would change color and potentially even emit fluorescent light. And somehow, people with these cats would conclude from that there must be a leaking underground radiation source, and they'll leave the greater Carlsbad area and go to where their cats no longer glow. The whole point of WIP is that we can take a glove that may or may not have traces of plutonium on it. We can take that from a site somewhere else in the United States, bring it all the way to New Mexico, and bury it ostensibly for eternity. But so to do all of that with billions of dollars spent, it was a 100,000-page environmental application in order to get WIP constructed. It was thus like the lowly fox that brings down Alexander's gates. It was eye-opening and sobering to realize that in 2014, kitty litter almost undid the entire thing. So there was an explosion, and a barrel erupted down in the depths of WIP and released radiation throughout its own little panel. It's so much so that it caused $500 million worth of damage. Parts of WIP can no longer be used for their function, which ironically is to bury nuclear waste, but it's considered too dangerous to go into them, and they've been sealed off. And radionuclides actually were vented beyond the site. But the guy who figured out what happened realized that someone had packed these barrels using the wrong kind of kitty litter. They'd used organic kitty litter, which is it's a wheat-based absorbent. It sounds really good. It's organic. But normally it would be a clay-based absorbent, which can help with the radionuclides. And so there was a chemical reaction between the wheat and the radiation that caused the explosion. The same person who figured that out realized that 700 barrels were packed with the same kitty litter, and so far only one of them has exploded.
I've visited a lot of nuclear waste sites like Yucca Mountain and Oncolo in Europe, and scientists are always charged with making 100% safe facility, and then someone asks them the question, how can you be sure in 100,000 years that this is safe? And they just like, well, we can't. It's a very interesting problem. And
just briefly along those lines, what's interesting too is that many of the people that were actually tasked to write about the waste isolation pilot plant and look at the risk of what's called advertent entry, so that's people that are deliberately trying to get into WIP, they're basically just say there is no way to stop this. It's not a burglary-proof vault. If you're going to drill into WIP, you can do it. And so there's basically no way to make people not do that. But there was a really interesting quote from an individual who we put in the book. I can't remember it verbatim, but the paraphrase is basically, if you look at the history of human facilities that have been buried or put in the center of a pyramid or a tomb that has been of interest to archaeologists, when you look at how humans deal with things that have been hidden away or buried, basically none of our nuclear waste facilities have any chance of becoming, of actually fulfilling their long-term promise. And for somebody in the nuclear waste industry to say that, it's a bit like, okay, so
you mentioned that whole project of how to market, and a lot of the results of that, if you look at the markings that were on the outside of King Tut's tomb, they said, your family will become sick for generations. Like, it's basically all the same things we mark a nuclear waste site for, and it's nothing, nothing makes you want to think there's gold on the other side of that door more than that.
They didn't have glowing cats, though,
Yeah,
did
the glowing
they?
cats.